Now let's take a look specifically at the reign of the Stuarts, beginning in 1603 with James I succeeding Elizabeth I and ending in 1714. The context for this time period is much the same as during the Tudor period. Lots of religious tension. However, in the later Stuart period, after the execution of Charles I in 1649, the influence of the church reduces gradually, and Parliament's influence grows as a result of their victory in the English Civil War, leading to a decline in the influence of the king in the later period of the Stuarts. Whilst the influence of religion and the monarch declined, the unified law system remains. But during the English Civil War, from 1642 to 1649, law and order broke down, which led to the witch craze, which we'll discuss on a separate slide. What you see is the continuation of religious tension culminating in the Gunpowder Plot in 1605. A group of Catholics, including Guy Fawkes and Robert Catesby, plotted to blow up the Houses of Parliament, however were caught in the act. Therefore, the plotters were hanged, drawn and quartered. Due to a combination of factors, they challenged the key beliefs of the period, hierarchy and divine right. In addition to that, the slow, brutal method of their execution was designed to reflect the seriousness of the crime, in order for it to be a deterrent to stop other people challenging the authority of the monarch. The threat of treason still caused paranoia for the crown, therefore any act of treason was dealt with severely. The criminal was dragged through the town naked in order to humiliate them, whilst the crowd encouraged the treatment. Then the criminal was hanged until they were almost dead, cut open and then cut into 4 pieces, which were then spread out across the country. The body parts were displayed publicly around the country to act as a deterrent. The head was even placed on a spike on London Bridge, the message from monarchs clearly being, if you challenge us, this is what will happen to you. In the later Stuart period, you'll also see a decline in the influence of the king. This is because Charles I lost the English Civil War, which lasted from 1642 until 1649. At the end of this civil war, he lost to Parliament, led by Oliver Cromwell, and was executed. But when God did not send retribution for killing his chosen ruler, people began to question religion, leading to a gradual reduction in the influence of the church. Power in the country following this went to Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the Parliamentarian Army. He ruled from 1649 until the Great Restoration in 1660. So from 1649 until 1660, England was a republic. You had that until the Restoration in 1660, when Charles II became king, but kings no longer had the same power as prior to the English Civil War, and that's why we see an increase in the influence of government. One new method of law enforcement during this time was the introduction of Charlies. The growth in towns meant that new methods of law enforcement were needed. Charles tried to increase crime detection by introducing Charlies, effectively a town watch. These were based kind of old people who would wander around the town trying to make sure nobody burgled each other, basically. The idea being they were sort of a visible presence on the streets that would stop people committing crime. Another crime we see during this time period is poaching, a social crime, a problem which has persisted ever since the introduction of forest laws by William the Conqueror. During this time period, landowners introduced laws which allowed them to fence off and then close land which had previously been used by the public. This shows that the rich were trying to protect their own interests. However, just like during the Norman period, this impacted on the lives of the have-not, who still needed to live off the land in order to survive. So, what did poachers do in response to this? In response to this, they formed gangs in order to steal goods, but also to protect themselves from people who owned the land. Smuggling was a social crime, but many people protected smugglers, but government made it a felony. So let's talk about smuggling. The same attitudes for poaching and smuggling, so let's talk about smuggling. What we mean by this, by the way, about this smuggling being a social crime and that many protected smugglers, is that many people believed that smuggling was a government-made problem. They had introduced 2 harsh laws and 2 heavy taxes, which had led to an increase in smuggling. So some people sympathised with smugglers. let's have a look at how these attitudes manifested themselves. Well, some people saw poachers as heroes. They helped the public afford items which otherwise they could not, remembering a lot of the goods that we are discussing at this point are harmless goods. Things like coffee, brandy, tea, sugar, things that people wanted for everyday life. We are not talking about harmful goods such as guns and drugs. Communities helped smugglers hide their contraband. They also created a wall of silence for authorities, even providing false alibis for smugglers. Alibis meaning a reason they could not have committed the crime. Saying, "Oh, that they're not a smuggler. They were with me yesterday, so it can't be them who committed the crime." This meant that when authorities tried to challenge smugglers or arrest smugglers, societies simply defended the smuggler. Again, seeing the government as the real enemy, not the smugglers. People were often sympathetic towards smugglers because the actual goods that they were bringing into the country were legal and harmless. For example, tea. Many people saw smugglers simply as harmless adventurers. This is shown by the fact that a lot of people thought the government was acting unreasonably. One, by introducing harsh taxes on goods, which increased the demand for smuggling in the first place, but also through the use of harsh punishments for smuggling. This also increased public sympathy. So the government makes smuggling a crime punishable by death, and therefore now you can actually be killed for smuggling in a harmless goods. Effectively, this is authorities trying to protect their own interest because smugglers weren't paying taxes. In addition to that, another problem that authorities faced was that large numbers of people living on the coast were involved in smuggling, hiding contraband as in stolen goods, providing alibis, and even buying goods from the smugglers. So why would I grass them up when I want the things that they are providing for me? However, some people also saw smugglers as villains. They became increasingly violent over time, organising themselves into violent gangs. And the thing is, because smuggling carried the death penalty, if authorities attempted to arrest smugglers, it would often turn violent very quickly because smugglers may as well die fighting if they're just going to be sent to the gallows and hanged anyway. They also refused to pay taxes, smugglers, which meant the reason these taxes were in place was in order to help England fight expensive wars. So was smuggling jeopardising or compromising England's chances of winning wars? Many smugglers were also prepared to use extreme violence in order to intimidate witnesses. So when authorities tried to investigate smuggling, either people saw smugglers as heroes and therefore were unwilling to talk to them, or they saw them as villains but were too intimidated to speak to authorities anyway. Smuggling, as shown by the fact that smugglers were willing to kill informers. They're also willing to fight off customs officers, fight to the death, as I've discussed earlier. And the simple fact is, smuggling itself is a crime. Views of smuggling today are similar to during that time period. Although people are shocked and appalled by smuggling of drugs, guns, or even people, they don't have a problem with smuggling alcohol or cigarettes. It was the same beliefs in the 18th and 19th century. As long as the items were harmless, people were sympathetic towards smugglers, seeing the real enemy as being the government. People believed it was a government-made problem. They wanted to increase their revenue through heavy taxes. Many argued that smuggling was a government-made problem. The government increased taxes on products, which made it more profitable to smuggle goods. Smuggling only actually reduced once taxes were lowered. In addition to the reasons I've discussed earlier about why smuggling was hard to stop, there's also purely logistical problems of it, not just attitudes. You've got the simple fact that England's an island. It's got a huge coastline. This makes it difficult to enforce anti-smuggling laws because smugglers will just enter the country through an area where authorities aren't, where these coastal officers aren't. There's also the fact that there's the death penalty for smuggling, meant that smugglers were willing to fight to the death, and therefore authorities would immediately be challenged when facing a smuggler. They also operate at night, it makes them hard to see, and they were protected by the community, this idea of a wall of silence when authorities tried to investigate.